Tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern over on Gator 8, a new college football video drops. In this video, we'll talk about something that happened at BYU in the 1990s. And now, on with our feature presentation. September 23rd, 1984. It's week 4 of the NFL season, and as we reach the end of the first quarter of the year, we have a big NFC matchup on our hands down at the Superdome between the New Orleans Saints and the St. Louis Cardinals. Even though it's early in the season, there's a lot on the line for both of these teams. The Cardinals enter this game at 2-1, and they're tied for the division lead in the NFC East. If they can go on the road to New Orleans, something that they couldn't do last year in 1983 when they lost 28-17, then they can keep pace for first place in the division and put themselves in a good spot to compete the rest of the way, especially since last year, of the 4 teams to start at least 3-1 in the NFC, all but one of them made it to the playoffs. As for the Saints, who sit at 1-2, if you lose this game to drop to 1-3, not only are your chances of keeping pace with the San Francisco 49ers for the NFC West lead practically shot, but you've got quite the uphill climb to make it to the playoffs, especially since in the last 4 non-strike shortened seasons, only one NFC team started 1-3 and made it to the playoffs. Safe to say, there was a lot riding on this game. And for the fans at the Superdome on this September day at the start of autumn, they witnessed one heck of a football game. This was an absolutely wild game, where the lead changed hands quite a few times. The Saints led at 13-7 at the half, then lost the lead to fall behind 14-13 in the third quarter, then retook the lead to end the third quarter to lead at 20-14, then lost the lead again as the Cardinals scored 10 straight points to take a 24-20 lead, and then regained the lead once more by scoring 14 straight points thanks to a 30-yard touchdown pass by Richard Todd to Wayne Wilson and a defensive touchdown with no time left, eventually winning it by a final score of 34-24. It was complete madness, and it was quite the display of football, highlighted by a fantastic game courtesy of the Saints' defensive line from the perspective of forcing pressure, as they sacked Neil Lomax 5 times, highlighted by a strong running game, as the Saints picked up 152 rushing yards and over 4.2 yards per carry, and highlighted by the best game of tight end Hobie Brenner's eventual 13-year career with the team, as he finished the game with 6 receptions for 131 yards and a touchdown. The Superdome was rocking on this day, especially considering how the game turned out. In total, there were 58,723 fans who were in attendance at that game. And even though it wasn't enough to avoid a blackout, you could definitely feel their presence, hear their screams, and sense their energy and excitement. However, of the 58,723 fans to attend the game on this day, one of them has the distinction of being, without any shadow of a doubt, the dumbest fan in the history of the franchise. Of the hundreds of thousands, and heck, of the millions of people to ever root for the Saints and be a part of Who Dat Nation, someone has to be the dumbest of them all. And by God, someone in attendance at this game easily earned that distinction with flying colors. This isn't a case of them cheering at the wrong time, or leaving early, or even getting ejected from the game for doing something stupid and having a bit too much liquid courage. This is, well, you have to see it for yourself. Because of all the fans that the Saints have ever had, this is the story behind what has to be the dumbest one of them all. Before I talk about the fan in attendance at the Superdome on this day, we need some context to understand what was taking place before this game and what this fan was engaged in. And before I go any further, unfortunately, while I am great at finding footage and obtaining footage, obviously, I have no footage whatsoever on the people involved in this story, so you're stuck with footage of the game that the Saints played in that turned out to be the backdrop and turned out to play a pivotal part in this story. And to do this, we have to talk a bit about the neighborhood of Algiers, New Orleans, for a bit. Algiers is the second oldest neighborhood in the city, and unfortunately, if there was one thing that Algiers was known for around this time, it was crime. I'm not going to dive too much into the history of crime in the region, but long story short, it was a relatively unsafe neighborhood where crime ran rampant, especially robbery. The most notable of these instances from 1984 came in January, when a burglar successfully stole over $76,000 in cash and valuables from a bank, causing thousands of dollars in damage to the building on top of it, and came in July, when an armed robber was arrested outside of a coffee shop in the neighborhood. Back in the 1980s, despite the neighborhood's rich history, Algiers was not exactly the safest place in the world to live in. And that's where we encounter a fan by the name of Anthony Weck, a 36-year-old man who was a season ticket holder for the New Orleans Saints. Makes complete sense for him to be a Saints fan and a season ticket holder, seeing as Algiers is not even 5 miles away from the Superdome where the Saints play. How long he had been a season ticket holder for the Saints, or how many games he had gone to, wasn't entirely clear or accessible. However, he had every intention of heading down to the Superdome on September 23rd for this big game against the Cardinals. However, disaster struck Weck when on Friday, September 21st, just 2 days before the game, someone robbed his house. As mentioned earlier, Algiers was unfortunately crime-plagued throughout the mid-80s, and Weck was a victim. Fortunately, no one was hurt throughout this, as all that was lost in the robbery was tangible things. However, these things were quite expensive and were worth a lot. These things included a $400 ring, a $200 chain, and as you might have been able to guess, the ticket to the Saints game. The man who executed the robbery was a 28-year-old man by the name of Kerry Williams. At the time, as a lot of robbers did, especially back in 1984 when home security was nowhere near what it is today, Williams got away, successfully got what he needed, and was not caught. I should note that Williams and Weck did not have any prior relationship, and the two men did not know each other whatsoever, so this was not premeditated in any way. Understandably, Weck was feeling incredibly dejected about this. Someone just came into his home, violated his privacy, stole somewhere worth of 4 figures worth of property when you add everything up, and took away his Saints ticket, which he was really looking forward to using. At this point, Weck had 2 options for Sunday's game. Option 1 was to just stay at home and watch it on TV. And if this was 2022, then maybe this is the option that Weck would have gone with. However, you have to remember that this is 1984 that we're talking about. Television blackouts were a thing, where if a game was not a sellout, then the game would not be televised locally. This was done as a way to actually incentivize people to go to the games, and we can argue about how effective the blackout policy actually was, now that it's history and has been for close to a decade. But regardless, this Saints game only drew 58,273 fans, in a stadium that held about 70,000. Now they were a very loud group of 58,273 fans that felt, sounded, and acted like a sold-out crowd, but it was not a sold-out crowd, no matter how you want to slice it. So that option was out the window. This meant that Weck was willing to go to option 2, which was to go to the game anyways, even though he didn't technically have a ticket. Maybe he would find someone and explain his situation and would be allowed to go into the venue. The Superdome held over 70,000 people, and it was nowhere close to a sellout. In the absolute worst case scenario, he could just buy another ticket and sit in one of the many unoccupied seats at the venue. In the best case scenario, he could show some form of identification to prove that he was telling the truth, that he was a season ticket holder, that he was in the team's database, and would be able to sit in his assigned seat, as though none of this, at least with regards to the Lost Saints ticket, had ever happened. And the good news for Weck was that when he got down to the Superdome and explained his situation to an official, he was allowed in the venue, and was given a special pass to sit in his assigned seat that was stolen from him by Williams. And as Weck was navigating the concourses of the Superdome to get to his seat, he found a man sitting in his seat. That man was none other than Kerry Williams. Don't worry, as if this wasn't already stupid enough, this story is about to get a whole lot stupider and more ridiculous. Obviously, Weck was confused about this. He got a pass to sit in his seat, and here was another man in said seat. But Weck thought that this was just a giant mix-up somewhere. So Weck did what any logical person would do in this situation, and reported to an officer nearby that someone was sitting in his seat. Maybe they double sold the ticket. Maybe the man was in the wrong section and read his ticket wrong. Maybe an official upgraded his seat and there was a miscommunication somewhere. There were a ton of possibilities. With that, Weck approached George Talar, who was a district attorney investigator working the game, and another officer. He told the two men his situation, and he went over to the seat assigned to him. At this point, the officers told Williams that he was in the wrong seat and had to move. Now think about what a logical person would do in this situation, especially evaluating things from a risk-reward standpoint, knowing that the reward is that you get to stay in your seat instead of just moving to any of the other unoccupied 12,000 vacant seats, and the risk is literal jail time. Williams clearly did not think about that, because he showed the officers the ticket that proved that he was in the right section and the right seat. As in, he showed the ticket that he stole from Weck. Naturally, Weck and the officers confronted Williams about this, and he said that he had no idea what they were talking about, and that he just bought this ticket from a scalper outside of the stadium. On one hand, it's a decent cover-up. On the other hand, let's think about this. Why would anyone, especially in this day and age where you had to physically stand outside the stadium, sell a $16 ticket for $5? Why would anyone waste that kind of energy for $5? Heck, when you factor in expenses like gas to get there and food and drinks that you might buy after selling if you're feeling hungry, you'd be more in the red even with the $5 than if you just ate the ticket. Plus, there was no denying that the ticket was stolen from Weck. Why would someone who just stole hundreds and maybe even thousands worth of items be concerned about $5? That's like if I accused Bill Gates of stealing the quarter that I had in my pocket. What's a quarter worth to him? There were some holes in his story, to say the least. But just when you think it can't get any stupider, and just when you think Kerry Williams might be able to get away with it, Anthony Weck noticed something. Remember what I said earlier about Weck losing a $400 ring and a $200 chain in the robbery? Yeah, the moron actually wore it to the game. Seriously. So not only did he rob Weck's house and steal his ticket, but then he took his ticket to the game, actually used it, assuming that Weck had 2 brain cells and wouldn't do anything about it or try and go to the game and get back what was rightfully his, and then wore the jewelry that he stole so that he couldn't even pass off his scalper story. Do you realize how dumb you have to be to do that? Like, if we're talking about the dumbest criminals alive, Saints fan Kerry Williams has to be up there. Because holy cow, this is just mind-numbingly stupid to the point where it's almost comical. This is like robbing a store with no mask on and with clothing, like a bright yellow shirt and a clown wig, and then coming back into the store a day later with the same exact clothing. You might as well just wear a shirt that says, "I am the burglar," and even that wouldn't be as dumb as what Williams did here. Unsurprisingly, Williams was arrested, was held on a $65,000 bond, and as he was being cuffed and taken away while Weck got his seat back, as the cherry on top, he said, "Man, I'm gonna miss the Saints game." Yeah, that's the least of your problems. Let's think of all the ways this could have been avoided, outside of the obvious of simply just not robbing the house. You could just not go to the game and not show up to a location where the man you just robbed is likely to be. If you wanted to go to the game, you could have used the ticket that you just stole and then found one of the 12,000 empty seats in the venue, especially since the ticket you got was only $16 at face value. So it's not like you were living in luxury anyways with your seat selection. When approached the first time, you could have just moved your seat and still been able to watch the game scot-free. When approached the second time, you could have not made up a story about the world's worst and least practical scalper. And then, as the cherry on top, you could have literally just not worn the ring and chain that you stole, and could have worn literally anything else, minus the evidence from the crime scene. Because even though the good news for Williams was that his Saints won, the bad news is that they won while he was behind bars. Because for as much drama as there was on the field on this day, there was even more drama off of it, thanks in part to what has to be, without a doubt, the dumbest fan in the over half-century-long history of the New Orleans Saints franchise. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.